I am James Cowling, CTO of OCG UK. With me, I'm pleased to welcome Alex Filipin, who is Senior Product Manager at Microsoft. He'll introduce himself in a moment. We are going to talk about identity management, mainly from a cloud-first point of view. First of all, by taking a bit of an interest in why EDU projects are different, EDU environments are different from corporate ones. This, of course, is important when we come to goals. It's important when we come to structuring projects. So start with that. We also share goals in common with all sorts of other environments. Let's talk about those. Then I'll ask Alex to talk about Entra ID Governance. He's responsible for that at Microsoft, so he will give us some insight there. And then we'll look into some down in the weeds, as promised, down in the weeds technical solutions to some of the problems that or targets that we'll raise in the early part of this conversation. That'll be the main part of the conversation, talking about how we make this really work. That was really the ask from the last webinar we did. Lots of people said, well, I heard your academic discussion of why we wanted cloud-first identity, but how do we make it work? So I'm keen to get into the weeds a bit and talk about how we might make this work. There's no single solution, of course, but we will be talking about that. And then sort of next steps, as usual. So with that, as I say, I'm the CTO of OCG in the UK. We're talking to the UK and Irish EDU community mainly. There are some guests from other parts of the world, and I welcome them too. We have several people from Austria, several people from Germany, and they're all welcome. We have a number of, I think, a couple of people from the US as well. So welcome one and all. Alex, if you'd like to say a word about yourself, just in the way of introduction.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you, James, for having me. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alexander Filipin. I'm one of the product managers working on Microsoft Entra ID Governance, mostly focused on lifecycle workflows and entitlement management, which you will also learn a little bit more about today. And yeah, James, excited to be here with you today.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we are recording this. This will be available for download later for some people who won't be able to make it. We're going to play this pretty straight in this session. As advertised in the registration part, we propose to fill the recorded part with sort of what you might call formal conversations with slideware and discussions. The slightly more informal answering of your questions we'll stop the recording, and then we'll go into a more of a sort of lock-in type of approach where we can freelance the answers a bit, and we'll assume that it's not being recorded and won't be published, and everyone can be a little bit more open about their problems and thoughts and concerns. Generally works better that way. That's going to be open-end. I have no particular plan to stop at any point. The recorded part will only run till 6. That's going to be our hard stop, and then anybody who can hang out for the questions afterwards, more than welcome. So with that, let's get cracking. First question, what makes EDU different? I think it's encapsulated mainly when I talk to customers and colleagues about EDU projects. We're talking about corporate scale without corporate budgets. That tends to be the main thing. So tens and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students in particular, but lots and lots of faculty, lots of collaborative work with visiting faculty and organizations like teaching hospitals or industry where we do research projects together. So big scale, unfortunately not big budgets, generally speaking. So that's problem one, or difference one. We have very large scale, very peaky activity, right? As well known, right? Peak periods, beginning and end of each academic year. And this compounds the problem of the budgets because we're not massively staffed to handle really big scale join and move a lever activity necessarily. A point made by several people, EDU really isn't interested in running data centers. Corporate might be, but EDU is interested in just getting on with their EDU lives. And so the observation is that EDU tends to be very cloud interested, particularly want to be running on-premises systems if they don't have to. So that gives us a slightly different angle. I don't know how many of you were at the Microsoft EDU conference in Bristol a couple of weeks ago. I was, and this interesting statistic came out that reported incidents in February 2024. EDU was massively ahead of other enterprise scale customers. So Kate Maxwell, who's the GM for worldwide education out of Redmond for Microsoft, she came over and gave a very interesting talk. And that was one of her stats, which I found very, very interesting. This isn't a conversation particularly about cybersecurity, But of course, one of the foundational, if not the foundational piece of cybersecurity these days is having your identities well managed. And so we are talking about cybersecurity, whether we like it or not. EDU has some quite interesting technology environments. Full disclosure, I'm married to a university professor, so I get the sharp end of some of this. So systems are bought with vendor-driven platforms, so mass spectrometers come with computers provided by the vendor. They're not necessarily easy to integrate into our environment, into our security management, and so on. There are colleagues in the educational space who display, let's call it, low compliance. People who think that their Linux machine from 20 years ago or their Windows XP workstation is absolutely ideal, and they refuse to give it up. So we have a couple of interesting angles there. A lot of collaboration and quite a lot of communication with alumni in a way that corporate doesn't so much do. Corporate's not that interesting. People who used to work for us, but we have a big alumni thing going on with EDU. So these are some differences that are worth pointing out. What makes us the same? Given that we're all concerned with cloud first, what does this mean? As I say, leading on from the idea that EDU doesn't want to be running data centers if they can avoid it, we're interested in cloud-only scenarios. A lot of universities we deal with are handling a lot of their students on an entirely cloud-only basis, and a lot of their faculty is moving in that direction. But of course, they still have hybrid systems with on-premises components as well. So making sure that cloud-only becomes kind of a default position and enabling those scenarios, that's step one. From an architectural point of view, and that's where I spend most of my life, being an architect for these things, most of the architectures that are proposed and have been proposed over the last decade or so have really made Active Directory the center of the world, and it's time to make Active Directory optional. If you look at your architecture today, it's not unlikely that Active Directory is really mandatory in the sense that a user arrives, the first thing they get is an AD account. After that, they might get a cloud account to go with it, and then they're sort of cloudy after that. It's not universally the case, particularly for those using school data sync, because that's really a cloud-first approach. But in a lot of cases, Active Directory is anything but optional, and we need to make it optional if we're proposing to build it back and use less of it in the future, because it's really a legacy system. The same applies to MIM. Now, I know there are people here who don't use MIM, but our legacy systems, which are doing identity management for us on premises, most of them really ought to be reduced. Certainly MIM needs to be reduced because of its limited support lifetime that's already visible. 2029 January is the threatened withdrawal of support from Microsoft, so we really need to be reducing that today and ultimately removing it from the environment. User satisfaction, particularly with pressures on budgets, it's very important to retain students, and they get quite frustrated if the IT and the experience isn't that great. So a lot of our EDU customers have a lot of focus on user satisfaction. And fundamentally, two things that we really share with a lot of people. We are committing to modern secure identity governance with standard protocols, which speaks for itself. It's important to make that commitment, actually make that statement, because it drives a number of steps that seem like just sort of clearing up old messes, but we really need to be doing them. And the assumption is that Entra ID is part of any solution. Otherwise, we're really talking to the wrong audience. But very broadly speaking, Entra ID, Microsoft's cloud solution, is part of any solution. So having said that, let's dive in quickly now. Putting this into context, Cloud First Identity, I did a whole webinar on this. It's available online if you want to see it. So I just want to start by talking about our sort of before and after scenarios. These aren't the only ones available. Down at the bottom, you can see a shortened link to the old webinar. It's not that old, it's like 5 months old or something, where we go into a lot of detail about different scenarios. If you're new to this, or you didn't see that webinar, I do recommend it. We talk about the various scenarios before and after of the journey to becoming a cloud first, or ultimately a cloud only organization. So that's an interesting discussion. Not going to repeat it now. I think the core scenario would be this one. This is kind of where we tend to be today, where in the middle, sort of vertical middle, is our silo of Active Directory with Entra Connect going up to Entra ID, and the management tools that do the work, whether it's MIM or something else. You might have a load of PowerShell scripts or some other platform doing it, but we tend to have management tools on-prem working with all these systems, but that tends to be the center of the web, if you like. We have HR data, we have student data coming in to that management platform, out to Active Directory, and then onto the cloud. That tends to be the order of things. And our goal in this conversation, and there are obviously lots of parallel activities going on, but this conversation is really about getting to here, which is where the identity data arrives first of all in the cloud, therefore achieving the goal of making our on-premises stuff optional. The business decisions are made in the cloud. The assignment of applications, the assignment of permissions to things are made in the cloud. In this case, we'll be assuming it's Entra ID Governance, because Alex is going to tell us about that. And based on those decisions, we may, or of course may not, do some downstream provisioning, including cloudy apps, Microsoft Cloud apps and others, and if necessary, provision to on-premises apps. We'll talk about exactly how this is working. We are picturing here a provisioning host. This is the ECMA host, for those who know these things. Talk about that in detail. And that may provision some systems directly, as shown by the right-hand arrow, or may provision into MIM, because MIM simply needs the HR data to do whatever it is that MIM does today. And so in order to get to cloud first, we need to keep giving MIM the data it needs, but we want to do that selectively based on need, and not because MIM simply gets all the data and makes its own decisions, because we're trying to unload the on-premises environment with a view to building it back over time and getting more to cloud first. So that's our goal scenario for this conversation. As I say, there are lots of bits going on in the, around all of this stuff, and we'll see a lot of them as we go along. Now, so that, because I'm slightly aware that this is, okay, James, you talk about these theoretical things all the time. I want to mention this project. It's a US university who, for this purpose, will have to remain nameless, but they recently went live with their Entra Governance project. They replaced 30+ PowerShell scripts that were running 50,000 students and 5,000 faculty with an Entra-focused solution. There's some MIM in the play there. HR data comes out of Workday, the SAS is Banner, and all that data ends up in Entra, where business decisions are made based on access packages and roles. Alex will be talking in detail about that if you haven't come across too much about that yet. All of these business assignments are made there. Downstream then, synchronization happens out of Entra ID to some things, out of MIM for other things, and they use access packages for the assignment, access reviews to do data cleanup based on their, as we all have, typically long years of collecting permissions creep and group memberships that were never cleaned up and that sort of thing. So they've cleaned up massively with access reviews, and they're much, much happier about their security and management posture now. So an example there, I'm going to give Alex the microphone, as it were, because he was actually involved in that project directly with some of our consultants as well. So Alex, perhaps you say a word or two about the way Entra ID fits into that.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to talk a little, take a moment generic take on the identity governance project, and then bring it back to that reference project that that James just mentioned, right? James did hit on that earlier a little bit. There's multiple reasons why we see identity governance projects, right, being spun up or modernizations taking place, right? And that spans across security, improving the security posture, managing the compliance risks and obligations that someone has, of course, the user productivity, right? You don't want someone to show up on the first day and not be productive. And then there's also the business agility angle, and that mostly feeds into the cost reduction area as well, right? Like it might be manual processes, but it might also be the maintenance of legacy tools. So in that particular project that we that James just referenced, right, there really was a lot of legacy tooling available that was a maintenance headache, and then secondly, it also didn't give the business or the IT the possibility to be fast, right? Like if new business applications were onboarded, changes were being made, they didn't have the agility to just adapt the way the faculty and the students were bringing up the needs to them. So, when we look at these four whys around why identity governance, right? Like really, all of them are always important, but in most organizations, there's somewhat a stack rank between these four, right? And depending on if you're primarily focusing on legacy tools, or if you're maybe you had a compliance issue, right? You didn't pass an audit, right? Like based on what happened in the past or what situation you're in, usually each company has their own stack rank when it comes to these. And it's always good to keep in mind, hey, why are we doing this? What's the top of the stack rank right now? What do we really need to focus on in this project? And that's then spanning into several scenarios that we can cover with governance in general, but also, of course, with Microsoft Entra ID Governance. And what we see from the deployments that are happening right now across our customer base, there's really 4 scenarios that our customers are mostly focused on right now. The first one is the employee lifecycle automation, right? Making sure the accounts are there on day one, provisioned to all directories and applications. And that also, when I say employees, I include students here as well, right? So faculty and students being included here. And then the second one is really, of course, when you provision the accounts, you want to make sure they have the right birthright access, right? But then there's needs beyond initial birthright access when it comes to governing application access and access to resources, right? And everything around that is usually a second bigger topic that might involve complex business applications, be it SAP, Salesforce, right, etc. And then we also see 2 additional scenarios, which are more like in the world of governing business guest and partner access, as well as governing privileged identities and their access. And so the 2 scenarios that are highlighted here, these are the 2 that were relevant for in this reference project for the university, right? We didn't, at least not in that project phase where I was involved in, we didn't touch the second 2 scenarios that we also see from other customers as being the deployment driver. And usually there's one top of mind scenarios when customers start modernizing or spun up any new identity governance project where this becomes relevant. That being said, that's the high level take on it. So let's take a quick look at how does that look like from a feature capability. And James, if you could go to the next slide for that, that would be amazing. Thank you. So when we look at Entra ID governance, we need to distinguish a little bit between the terminology used, right? Because there is a dedicated, and we will talk a little bit about licensing here on the slide, but there is a dedicated SKU that we are selling, Microsoft Entra ID Governance, that includes all our governance capabilities together, right? But we also have governance capabilities in lower licensing tiers, most prominently Microsoft Entra ID P1 and P2, which are then part of EMS and M365E and A3, A5, right? And so you can see on the left side, really we have a broad set of governance capabilities already in our P2 feature set, right? When it comes to HR and API-driven inbound provisioning, James will talk more about that. When it comes to outbound provision to application, but then also already in the access governance area with like self-service group and application assignments or dynamic groups that you can use for attribute-based access control, right? So there's already good capabilities on the P1 side. And then if you go into the P2 world, you get our good entitlement management and access review capabilities. You also get lifecycle management for business guests. You get our privileged identity management capabilities. And as further as we go with the Microsoft Entra ID Governance SKU, right, you then get at our advanced entitlement management capabilities, our advanced access certification and review capabilities. You get our lifecycle workflows capability. You also get higher daily usage volumes for our API-driven inbound provisioning. And so that's just high level. We won't have enough time today to go over all these capabilities, of course, and James has spoken to some of them in previous webinars. But a few things I want to highlight. One is that we have 2 different billing models. One is for our workforce, for the usual workforce, and that includes faculty and students, where we have a billing model which is per user per month, right? You buy seats. And then on the business guest side, we blogged about this a while ago, and I can link the blog as well. We have a monthly active usage billing model. That basically means, hey, we're only going to bill you from a governance perspective for that business guest if we are also have taken governance actions on that business guest in the given month. And then the second one that a few more things worth calling out here is we do have dedicated discounted SKUs for faculty, students, and also frontline workers when it comes to Microsoft Entra ID Governance. So please speak if you are interested after this webinar. Please speak with your account representative when it comes to the pricing details. I won't be able to share like any prices today, but there are dedicated discounted SKUs for faculty, students, and frontline workers available. And then The second thing worth mentioning is that Microsoft Entra ID Governance is a step up either from P1 or P2. So even if you only had like a EA3 license today, you can buy Microsoft Entra ID Governance without necessarily stepping up to P2. You then also get all the governance capabilities that would be included in P2. So you can buy P1 plus governance. And when it comes to, I think we had some questions about that submitted previously as well. Right now, there are no student use benefit ratios for Entra ID Governance. So it's not that you buy for one faculty and you get like 40 licenses for free for your students. That's not the case, but we do have the discounted SKUs available that you can then buy for the students and the faculty members. All right, and with that, I would give it back to James.
Yep, thanks, Alex. So digging down a bit, I'm not going to read this out. We're just going to do 3 quick sections. We need to talk about the upstream part. So the upstream part is, well, we'll talk about them separately. Upstream first, then Alex will talk a bit more about the detail in Entra ID Governance, and then I'll talk a bit more about the downstream part, in other words, coming out of Entra ID Governance and getting out into the real world, not just MIM, but also including MIM and our on-prem identity management, with an idea of what we might do to take our decisions out of Entra and provision them into the real world. So that's going to be what we're going to look at. When we talk about upstream provisioning, this is getting our HR data, our student data, our human data into the identity world so that we can make identity governance decisions about them. And when we talk about this, and there was, again, referring to the previously posted questions on the way in, we find that we have, broadly speaking, 2 different scenarios when we talk to EDU customers. We have EDU customers who have what we call the single sources of truth scenario. This means that each user's data comes from a single system at any single point in time. A single person, a human, may have multiple users. So they might have a student account, they might have a faculty account if they're a teaching assistant, they might have various accounts for various different roles. And the student account comes from the SIS, maybe via School Data Sync. Their faculty account for teaching might come from an HR system of some sort. They've got multiple accounts. That scenario is actually simpler to implement, but it does, of course, mean you've got multiple user accounts, multiple license requirements, multiple various things. It does give you a nice clean separation between those accounts. It's also not necessarily the ideal user experience because they've got multiple accounts to log into. But that is a scenario that's used by a number of our customers, and therefore is entirely worth talking about. The second scenario, the multiple sources of truth, there we say, okay, we want really one account per person, partly for licensing reasons, partly for user experience reasons, and that user account needs to be given the right permissions for the student part of their life, for the teaching part of their life, for all the other bits of their life. And to do that, we need to draw on information from these multiple sources upstream of Entra and provide a consolidated view of the data into Entra. And so we need to consider both of these scenarios, and we will now do that. I'll talk a bit about each of them. So this is a Microsoft slide. But basically in the middle, this is the target of this conversation, the Entra provisioning service is where we're going to be pushing our data. And this is kind of a single sources of truth scenario. Multiple sources, but each of them is a single source for each object, right? So School Data Sync provides us perhaps with our SIS data, gives us users and also, of course, assignments to teams and other richer functionality like that. And we might have an HCM app, some sort of HR app, Workday or something out there in the world as well, or some Oracle or whatever else is going on. But each of these apps is independently of each other talking to the provisioning service. The provisioning service is consuming that data and making it available with these details later, but making it available to Entra at least, and possibly also to Active Directory for then further downstream processing. So this, if you like, is the single sources of data. Each of the applications that we deal with upstream of the provisioning service is in Entra an application in its own right, an enterprise application that has its own configuration, and very often that's a fairly straightforward single sort of user interface style configuration. You simply choose the attributes you want and start the provisioning. It's not quite that simple, but it can be that simple. In the more complex situation, we have to perform upstream consolidation, and there's always a question about how we think we might do this. There are a number of ways of skinning this cat, but with a view to a sort of ETL, extract, transform, and load type of a scenario, we are recommending, and Microsoft also is recommending for this sort of consolidation, the cloudy Azure Data Factory approach, which is, for those on-prem people around here, kind of the successor to SQL Server Integration Services. That's probably very insulting to Azure Data Factory, but that's pretty much what it does. Data orchestration for data activities. So we extract from the various systems we've got, we bring the data together, transform it in whatever way we need to, and build consolidated data sets, which are then loaded as a single source of truth, if you like, into the provisioning service. So that's where we do our business logic to do the consolidation up front of student plus HR to make sure we've got the right set of attributes to drive the business logic in Entra on the far side of all of this. So in very, very high level, I mean, I can show you some data factory stuff later if you like, but it's really just a question of doing the data work you need to do, extract the data from the relevant source, and then perform queries and transformations to get it into the shape you need before you upload it. We're going to go into some detail into the provisioning API now, because that may be new to some of you, or relatively new. Some of you may be aware that the Graph API has kind of traditionally been a way of getting data into the Microsoft cloud. I've just laid out, these are technical matters here, the difference really between the provisioning API and the Graph API. Really the most important point is probably the one at the bottom, rather perversely, but you can see the provisioning API is massively quicker than the Graph API and is also less subject to throttling. It also has the advantage of being asynchronous, the provisioning API. So as far as we're concerned, we just spew out all this data up into the cloud as quickly as we like and then go about our business. And this might be an automated tool that has other things to do. So it's convenient if we can push data asynchronously. It's then consumed over time by the provisioning API. It does its business. The Graph API is synchronous, so we're waiting for the calls to complete. And that can be slightly slow. It's distinctly slower than the provisioning API. The last point I'll make to this is that from a data standpoint, for those of you who handle data transformations before upload, the Graph API requires graph references. In other words, the objects that we address are graph objects. We need the graph GUID of the object, the Entra GUID for the object we're referring to. And if we have references to other objects like managers or course leaders or whatever we're talking about, some reference to some other object, we need to provide the GUID of that object, which we might not have. We might need to go and do a lookup to get it, which slows us down even further. So the provisioning API data, on the other hand, works entirely with local IDs. In other words, the employee ID, for example, out of the HR system, and the employee ID out of the HR system for the manager, both in the same record. And that reference is resolved by the provisioning API as the data arrives. We don't have to do the work. Okay, so we don't have to do the mappings ourselves. We don't have to determine what create and update jobs need to be done. We don't need to generate patches or posts or whatever we're doing in Graph. We just send the data, and provisioning API deals with what needs to be updated. Okay, so you can see a couple of limitations. At the moment, it's really only intended for users, for user data, and it's entirely write-only at this point, which I think makes sense. We're not really interested in reading using that, but we push a whole bunch of data very fast with this asynchronous provisioning API. So in the way of introducing it to you, that's why we're talking about provisioning API instead of Graph. I'm not saying you can't use Graph, and for some things like non-users, you will have to use Graph, but for the bulk of our users, we'll simply use the provisioning API. In order to do that, we will install an application. It's a gallery application. For those of you familiar with the Entra language, it's just available as a tile that you can select from the gallery, entitled API-driven provisioning to Microsoft Entra ID. And then it needs some configuration. You can see, if you're an identity guy or girl, you can see some classic things here: credentials, attribute mappings, scoping, filters, and provisioning down at the bottom there. So that'll sort of ring a bell, the sort of thing we're going to configure. At this stage, I'm not going to go into massive detail, but there it is. A little bit more detail here. Some mappings there. There's a mapping set in the middle here, talking about a SCIM schema, which brings us the standard SCIM enterprise schema, and we can map the attributes inbound. I'll show you that on the next slide, I think. We map the attributes inbound from the external system into the Entra ID attributes that we want to populate. You can see we can perform transformations as well. So over on the left-hand side, you can see what we can do, direct flows or expressions. This is familiar to many of us from identity management systems of all flavors, but you'll find your way here fairly easily once you start taking a look at it. So that's what we configure on the inbound application. The inbound application, as I say, might be an inbound application generically for the provisioning API. There are also inbound applications specifically for individual things like Workday itself, for example, if we have a direct pull from Workday. All right, so very much an overview in the time available, but that's the detail of the mappings that we have. I'm often asked, well, what does it feel like to run one of these systems? All the people I talk to run MIM systems. MIM guys spend a lot of time in the MIM synchronization manager, making sure that there are no errors, making sure in the logs that nothing much has happened. And just from this gathering of screenshots, you can see that the reporting, the insights that we can gather into the provisioning, this is just inbound, but it's similar for outbound. You can see in a rather more attractive graphical way what's been happening, updates and creates. You can see success and failure rates. You can see in absolute detail what was done with particular attributes. And it's worth one more word to the question of logging. For audit purposes and for analytics, we do get extremely detailed logging. We get the old and new values. This is a create, so the old values are all empty, but we get all the old and new values for updates. And that can be taken into log analytics for whatever use you need it for. Just pointing out in the bottom attribute down there, that's the past profiles attribute. It's possible for us on a user preference basis, we can configure this to redact values from the logging, so that because we don't want quite a lot of private information for privacy reasons, data protection reasons, shouldn't go into log analytics. Not interesting. We're interested in activity, maybe we're interested in permissions perhaps, but the personal data doesn't need to be logged, so we can redact that from the logs if we want to. All right, now at this point, this is the upstream part, right? So we've got upstream data, we've consolidated it, it's coming into Entra. MIM hasn't seen any of this data yet, Active Directory hasn't seen any of this data yet. We now need to decide what to do with this data. Does this user stay cloud only, or are they going to be have some on-premises pieces as well? And for this, I'll show you Alex's first slide while he gets ready.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, when we, as James described, we need to get the user into the Entra side, and then of course there's a bunch of additional processes that are happening. When we look at that from a user journey perspective, just kind of like two angles that we can take on it. One is that, of course, once we have the base account for the user, right? We need to make sure we're granting the access rights, the birthright access to the user, right? But then once the journey of the user goes on, they of course will at some point need additional access, and we need to provide them with some kind of self-service access request capabilities. If they are for example, in the IT department, right, then they probably also have access to highly privileged resources and something like just-in-time access, and approvals come into the picture. If they have access to certain sensitive information, then access recertification, right, comes into the picture. And of course, at the end, we have the offboarding journey. So if we talk about that, it was a kind of like a technical take on it, right? We have the birthright access, self-service access request, access certification, etc. And then of course there's also auditing and reporting aspect to it. Now we could probably spend on each of these topics a single webinar, right? So in interest of time, we need to zoom in a little bit. And what we will zoom in a little bit more today is more on the joiner mover leaver story, and focusing a little bit more on the lifecycle workflows and entitlement management capabilities for that. And just to bring back that three-step process that James also kind of talked about, right? We are always talking about the end-to-end process automation. So let's keep the scenario in mind. If it's a joiner that we're talking about, right, then we need to get the data in from our HR-driven provisioning capabilities. And then once we're on the Entra side, we need to automate certain complementary tasks, right? And that's where lifecycle workflows can help. When it comes to error-prone tasks, lifecycle workflows can actually getting the password to the new hire, making sure the hardware is hired for that person, right? But then also, it's not just lifecycle workflows. Earlier, when I talked about licensing a little bit, right, I showed the various capabilities that are spread across our licensing spectrum, basically. And all of them, once the user is within Entra, right, they can kick in. So it's not just lifecycle workflows that get started once the account is provisioned. There is also entitlement management with its automatic assignment policies that helps with birthright access. There are dynamic groups that can help with birthright access, right? And then, of course, not shown on this slide in the joiner scenario because it's usually a little later, we have the self-service access request capabilities of entitlement management, but also our group and application self-service capabilities that are available as well. And once they work together, right, then we can, and that's what James will speak to later as well, then we can start the point of, okay, it doesn't help if just within Entra we say the user needs that and that application, right? We also need to get that information over to the target system into the business application so that they are aware of the changes and the business logic that has been applied on the cloud side. So that process that we see here for joiner, it's a very similar story for lever as well, right? It's somewhat same process that the system or the information flows through, and the same story also for mover. Of course, there are slightly there's slight differences here, but at the big picture, it's always that end-to-end process that is running across our governance capabilities that are within Microsoft Entra ID Governance. So never zoom in on like maybe it's just lifecycle workflows, it's just HR prone provisioning, it's just entitlement management. No, if you want to facilitate the scenario end to end, it's all of them working together. But as I said today, it will be a little bit tricky to talk to all of them. So that's why we're going to zoom in a little bit more on lifecycle workflows. As I mentioned earlier, a lifecycle workflows is really there to automate these slow and error prone manual processes that might take place, right? That involves generating, for example, the password or the temporary access path and sending that to the new hire. It involves sending email notifications after the account was provisioned. Maybe you want to know, maybe you want to let the new hire know or the manager know that the account have been provisioned. Maybe you need to notify some central IT team about that, right? It also involves, for example, we see customer using our extensibility with ServiceNow to create service tickets for the hardware procurement of the user, right? And so what we do in lifecycle workflows is we came up with a concept of scenario-based templates, and we want to, I talked about this earlier, right? We also want to improve the time to value, how quickly you can set up certain governance processes. So we get you started with scenario-based templates around joiner, mover, and lever, and you can see that there are multiple ones because we have this timing concept of pre, on, and post, which basically allows you to, at the different time steps of the joiner, mover, lever process, insert your business processes, right? When we say hardware procurement, for example, we don't want to create the ServiceNow ticket on the day the new hire shows up, because then they walk into the office and the laptop is not ready, right? We want to do that maybe 14 days before. So the lifecycle workflows have this timing concept where you can say, okay, please start something 2 weeks before their first day. Or if it comes to, like, for example, account cleanup and deletion, that's where a post offboarding workflow then can help them say, hey, let's 2 months after they left the organization, let's delete the account, for example. So that timing concept, very important, and it's incorporated into our scenario-based templates. And I'm going to go a little quicker over some details. We have various triggers that you can use for lifecycle workflows to start them. For the process automation, so there's date and time-based attributes with offsets. That's what I just meant with the different timing steps. We support a employee hire date there that we added to Entra. We support an employee leave date there. We also support the account creation date if you want to key off of that. We have an on-demand functionality as well, where you can say where the administrator can just provide a user ID and or select the user and we run the workflow for them. Then we also have recently brought to general availability our attribute changes trigger. So if you want to do something in the mover scenario, for example, start a workflow when the department changed or when the job title changed, right? That's where the attribute change trigger comes in. And then we also have a group membership change trigger, which you can configure to say, hey, start this workflow when the user gets added or removed from a certain group. Now, how does that map to joiner, mover, lever? We do support dynamic groups. So sometimes you want to craft more advanced, complex queries that maybe involve more than just the employee hire date, right? And the group membership change trigger with the dynamic groups gives you additional flexibility here for certain scenarios. But we also have what we call our scoping capability. So even if you say start the workflow on the first day, you can still further scope down the workflow. And we support regular attributes, directory extensions, on-prem extension attributes, and custom security attributes, which we also recently brought to general availability here. So if you want to filter on the employee type, for example, being an FTE, then you can still do that with our time-based triggers as well, where you say start the workflow on the first day, but this is the workflow for the FTEs, and then you might have another workflow for contractors and other workflow for students, for example. And from a capability perspective, lifecycle workflows gives you more than 20 built-in tasks that span across different scenarios when it comes to like notifications, account management, access assignments, credential management, license management, without going into all of them. So that's really, when you think about lifecycle workflows, it's automating these time-consuming, manual, error-prone tasks, right, and helping you with that. It touches the access assignment area a little bit, so you can say assign the user to certain groups, or you can trigger assign the user to certain access packages. That's a capability that is available within lifecycle workflows. But when we think about making sure that the people have the right access to the right resources and application, that's really where we have our entitlement management capabilities. And think about, we call it an access package. You might hear about it in other governance tools, more like from a business role perspective. But essentially, we have the ability to create an access package that contains a collection of cross-application entitlements, right? So that can be a Teams membership, it can be role in a target application like Tableau, and then you can user assigned to that access package, and once a user gets assigned to that access, they gain access to all the resource, the cross-application entitlements that are within the access package. There's a lot of detail here that I will have to skip today in the interest of time on how people get assigned to access packages, what the approval processes could look like when someone gets assigned, what the review processes look like. So there's very rich feature sets and capabilities available around access packages. So if the business role and modeling areas is of interest of you, I encourage you to dive deeper into them. From a supported resource perspective, we saw in access package, we support applications that are integrated with Entra, right? So on the Entra side, once you integrated them from a provisioning or single sign-on perspective, you can use them. We support groups, SharePoint site, Teams, Entra ID administrative roles. So you can get a lot of things integrated into the access package, also because groups are, of course, like a bridging technology to a lot of other capabilities. Then groups, for example, we can also, James will talk about this more in a second, write back to on-prem, so that you can then govern access to on-premises applications with access packages that are governed and maintained in the cloud. And the last bit worth highlighting, access packages also have what we call an automatic assignment policy, which allows you to define, for example, departmental access. And it's a little, it's more advanced than dynamic groups. It leverages the dynamic groups technology if you're familiar with them. But you can, for example, see in the screenshot, we also allow retention, for example, in a dynamic group. When someone no longer satisfies the criteria, right, they are removed from the access. In auto assignment policies, for example, you could say, well, this is a mover event. They are transitioning. They probably still need access for 30 more days. So you can configure a transition period, for example. Similar, we have our custom extensibility where we integrate with logic apps as part of the assignment process. So you can embed your custom processes as well once they start matching or no longer matching the criteria. And so, yeah, that was a very quick overview of some of the capabilities on the cloud side. And I'm sure we can spend more time on them in the future as well. James, with that, I would give it back to you on the outbound provisioning pieces.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so we've done in the middle now. We've made our business decisions. We've assigned applications, and now it's time for the outbound stuff. I want to put this into the sort of global perspective because I wouldn't like anybody to think that I was totally fixated on MIM. Some people seem to believe that, but there are lots of other things in the world apart from MIM, you know. And Entra ID has a whole bunch of gallery applications that simply can be selected, and the configuration for provisioning into those applications outbound here is not particularly complicated in most cases. That's just a very small selection. For those of you who are new to this, I just wanted to point out that the ones that support provisioning have this provisioning icon on them. If they don't have that, then it's a single sign-on integration, which is valuable in itself, but it's not what we're talking about today. One of the things I do want to focus on how we can keep our legacy identity management platform working. In this case, MIM, in my case, MIM probably, but in any case, an on-premises system can be integrated using this application you can see at the bottom there, the on-premises ECMA app, whatever that is. The ECMA is the Extensible Connectivity Management Agent from MIM, and we can work with our legacy applications using that. On the left-hand side here, I've just pointed out the out-of-the-box targets that we can use. So we can talk to SQL targets, LDAP targets, PowerShell, web services, which is typically used to talk to things like SAP systems on-prem, and we can use any custom ECMA2s that we've written for MIM. They will work in this host as well, and typically we'll be interested in trying to integrate our MIM using one of these systems. It might be that we'll use PowerShell to write directly into MIM. It might be that we use an LDAP intermediary like an ADLDS store, depending on whether we've got a MIM portal or not. We might use a shared ADLDS store to share identity data, something to get the data into MIM. And with that, moving swiftly on to ways of getting data into MIM, it's worth pointing out, of course, there are lots of ways of getting data out of Entra into MIM. Microsoft supports most of these, if not all. The primary and most obvious sort of Microsofty way of doing it is to put the data first into Active Directory with Entra Connect or with direct provisioning to AD. That doesn't really apply in my scenario. We're trying to make Active Directory optional, so building AD in as a sort of primary integration between Entra and MIM doesn't seem to be what we're aiming for. It's possible to use GraphMA or some sort of graph agent that goes out and pulls fresh user data out of Entra. Perfectly valid. Don't have an issue with it really. I'm just not a big fan of pulling data if it can be pushed. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to talk about using this ECMA host to get data pushed out of Entra towards our on-premises system. I'm using MIM in this case, but you've seen that we can push data into various stores and then retrieve it using our on-premises system for further processing. So that's what we're going to talk about. So this last part is the subject of the remaining technical pieces here. For those of you who haven't seen it before, this is what the ECMA host looks like on-prem. It's a very lightweight, sort of kind of MIM sync light, if you like. It doesn't have a database behind it. It's all in memory. It processes outbound provisioning and change information based on the SCIM protocol and pushes the SCIM instructions that it receives from Entra ID out to whatever targets we deliver here. You can see in this case we've configured a PowerShell configuration to push provision data into the MIM service, which underpins the MIM portal if we're using that, which is that would be entirely analog to a user that got typed into the MIM portal as an external user, for example. So a good jumping off point to get into the MIM system. An alternative approach, if you don't have the MIM service running in your environment, but you have some sort of synchronization service, an ADLDS, an Active Directory lightweight directory service, is a very good lightweight and cost efficient way, as well as a very resilient way of providing a shared store that Entra can write into, and we can retrieve data very efficiently with good deltas. We can retrieve data out of that very fast into our MIM or other identity management platform on-prem. So these are useful ways of doing things. I've just put a screenshot of the configuration there. Anybody who really is a MIM person will sort of recognize the sorts of things we're configuring here. Not going to go into that any deeper than that for the time being, but that's the ECMA host. So this sits between Entra ID and MIM and translates the SCIM inputs that Entra delivers based on a push protocol. So when I get a new assignment or a change, I get the changes pushed out by a SCIM, and those changes land in whatever targets we've configured here. So we're going to run out of time, right? But in the broad sense, the sort of solution we're proposing, now this is by no means intended to be this is your solution, right? But this is the sort of thing that we've been doing. We have sources. Ultimately, it's probably some sort of SQL table or something like a SQL table if it's not school data sync, but some sort of source of data. This might be our consolidated data from multiple sources of truth. That gets pushed into Entra ID via the provisioning API. That picture on the left actually is the logic app that does it in our very simple test environment. It's not a complicated process. And there's plenty of space for expansion to add relevant business logic for consolidations or transformations, whatever you need. So it's a fairly straightforward logic app to get data posted up to the provisioning API. The data then appears in Entra, and there's a little screenshot of our friend Arthur, who's a student, appearing in Entra. Then Arthur goes through the Entra governance processes, gets some birthright assignments. One of the things he gets assigned, if he needs access to some sort of on-premises systems, maybe needs some Active Directory for some reason, one of the things they get assigned is the MIM app. The MIM enterprise application is assigned via these various methods in the access package to Arthur. It's all automatic. And then a skim instruction is sent out to the Entra host to say, hey, MIM, you should have this. And the data ends up in MIM. And there's a screenshot of the page in MIM where Arthur is received. So this is real, it works. This works perfectly well. It takes a few minutes to go through, so I'm not going to do it live. For the purposes of this exercise, it might take 10 or 15 minutes for that all to run through all of the various calculations that have to happen. But it's usually not time critical beyond that. And then I've got a ... after MIM. Of course, the purpose of this exercise is not to get data into MIM. The purpose is to have the provisioning and management tasks that MIM does today anyway, to get MIM to continue to do that. Okay, so that we, at least initially, don't need to re-engineer our entire environment. Of course, the future purpose is to bypass MIM, get a lot of what we can do done directly without MIM having to be involved, and begin to unload MIM with a view eventually to retiring MIM. So there's a summary picture for you. This brings us to a discussion a little bit about sort of next steps. What do we think should happen? I mean, some of this is a bit obvious and generic, but you need to set your own goals and priorities. So you need to, Alex talked about the priority stack of the things you want to achieve. We've talked about a number of things you can achieve. In my humble advice would be not to try and achieve all of them at once, but you're going to come up with a priority list of things you want to achieve and set out to address them in the right order, while maintaining, of course, a stable environment for the rest of the things that you haven't got a chance to move yet. You'll need to deal with the question of licensing and funding. This stuff is not free. Alex has talked about the very, very deeply discounted prices that you can get as an EDU outfit against the corporate prices that Microsoft's asking. So it's, they're very deeply discounted, but you'll need to get into that. Obviously, make sure you've got the money to cover that. Will be from a narrow MIM standpoint, we're going to be worrying about identity management workloads and which of those we want to move to Entra at all, and which of those are just going to stay where they are because they address perhaps legacy on-premises systems that are going to either be migrated away to cloud or are simply going to die in place over the next few years, might get sunsetted over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. So those workloads, you might say, well, they'll just stay where they are until that legacy system is finally sunsetted. So you've got to make a priority list. What do we think we can unload from MIM sooner or later, or what are we just not going to bother with until the target system just goes away? And of course, I mean, to encourage you to talk to us to make a plan to help you put all this in perspective, but I guess that was inevitable in such a webinar. So a couple of points from our experience around the way we engage with EDU as OCG now. It's important in our experience to deal with EDU customers differently from corporate customers. There are consultancies that don't make a difference, but we very much see a difference between EDU engagements typically and corporate, mainly because of the budget constraints that EDU face. What we like to do and what customers have liked to do in the past is that the EDU staff take on quite a lot of the execution of the new project. This is pretty obvious really as a goal. The new staff are motivated to do it. They're not so thrilled about looking after legacy technology. They want to get into the new technology. And of course, they've got to run this thing once it's in production. So them helping build it, or actually executing quite a bit of the building, is a good idea in the first place. But to do that, we need to unload them from their current tasks. So this is where OCG might come in to, first of all, obviously bootstrap the whole process, get you up to speed, but also maybe take on the suggestion at the bottom there, take on the support and maintenance of your existing system so that your staff just don't have to do it anymore. We'll patch your SharePoint, we'll patch your MIM, we'll look after error handling or whatever is needed to make sure the system's basically running. to free up your staff to move forward. That tends to be a welcome break for those who've been sort of stuck with the old stuff. My big thing that I've mentioned before on webinars, evolutionary projects rather than revolutionary projects tend to work better. Our problem is, it's not a big problem, but technology is moving on all the time. Alex has just talked about features that have only recently hit the world into GA, features that we didn't necessarily even know were coming a year ago. So planning more than a few months ahead even is quite difficult in this environment because of the speed of development of the software. And so evolving our project, rather than having a big bang, we're going to throw it all out and build a new platform, it's just more sensible really to take small frequent steps. We're going to move this piece with visible technology that's going to be working in 3 or 6 months, and then we can review what the next step is based on the emerging technology as it comes. That makes some people nervous, this idea that we don't have a big plan and we know where we're going to be in 5 years, but it's just the reality of the modern world with cloud technology moving on all the time. A 5-year plan, except in the broadest strokes, doesn't really make much sense in detail because we don't really know what the technology is going to do in 5 years in detail. So differences there, the way we would engage with you. So that brings me really to my second last slide really. What does OCG do? Why did we invite you here in the first place? We offer fixed price support for MIM solutions and Entra Connect solutions. This really is fixed price. We will support your platform for a year for a price, and there won't be any argument about how many tickets you've had or how often you've used it, or no, this doesn't, we won't be entirely rebuilding your system and re-engineering it. That's not what support is. But the support cases will be covered by a fixed price. You have complete certainty that your support is covered for the year, right? If we end up doing far more support than we got paid for in the first year, we'll be talking about that for the second year, but that's our problem. Okay, so that's what we're doing. Many of those support contracts already, people, that they work out pretty well for everybody. The obvious next step really is to talk about a design workshop. A number of things that have come up in this workshop, in this webinar, have been kind of options. You could go this way or that way. This might be your scenario, that might be your scenario. So you really need to drill down on what is my scenario, where do I want to get to, what is my object model, my user model, how many sources of truth do I have, that sort of stuff. So that needs to be done. I wouldn't like you to feel that OCG won't just build your project if you want us to. We're perfectly happy to execute the project for you, or any part of it that you care to trust us with, or just to do more of a hand-holding exercise to get you into a position to deliver the project. These are all delivery options. We do training and workshops frequently to spin everybody up. Both consultants and customers come to us for training and workshops. And one that's particularly near to my heart because I wrote it and deliver it is the Hybrid Identity and Security in Microsoft Environments workshop. This is an extremely deep dive into hybrid security. Wrote it in conjunction with Vattenfall, who run nuclear power stations and reprocessing plants. They take their security exceptionally seriously, and they put 60 people through this workshop so that all of their staff, many of whom didn't even know they had anything to do with security, were talking the same language around security. So I can thoroughly recommend that to you. Fully deep dive into Kerberos, into OpenID Connect, into primary refresh tokens, into crypto, where the weaknesses are, where the strengths of modern technologies are. And it's not exactly a good laugh, and we have the occasional laugh, but it's pretty hardcore stuff and really good to do. So I thoroughly recommend that to you. So with that, and we're on the dot of 6 o'clock, rather coincidentally, I invite you to connect with us as you would like to. There are various ways of getting hold of us. My email address is there, Alex's email address is there. And I do thank you for spending the time with us today. And with that, I would invite my moderator, Mary, to close out the recorded session. And this